I knew something was wrong before I even killed the engine. You ever get that feeling where your stomach drops for no reason? Like your body notices danger before your brain catches up? Yeah, that was me pulling into my driveway that Thursday afternoon. I'd been gone 4 days doing electrical work down in Bozeman. Just enough time to come home tired, hungry, wanting a beer in silence. And instead I found orange paint sprayed all over the dirt around my cabin like somebody had outlined a crime scene. There were tire tracks cutting through my grass, heavy equipment parked halfway up my hill, and right beside my porch sat this giant steel rig bolted into the ground like they were about to launch a damn rocket. For about 10 seconds I just sat there staring at it through the windshield, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation that didn't involve complete insanity. Then, one of the workers walked past carrying a chain thick enough to tow a freight train, and I realized, no, these people really had lost their minds. My cabin sits on the western slope outside Alder Ridge, Montana, about 20 minutes from the nearest gas station and far enough up the mountain you can actually hear the wind move through the pine trees at night. I built the place myself 10 years ago after my divorce. Nothing fancy, just cedar siding, metal roof, wraparound porch, wood stove that smokes too much when the weather turns cold. But every board in that place has my fingerprints on it. I dug the post holes by hand, hauled half the lumber up the hill in an old Ford pickup with a transmission that sounded like a dying moose. Back then, I didn't have much except debt, a toolbox, and a stubborn streak wide as the state of Montana. But that cabin became the first thing in my life that actually felt stable. Most folks left me alone up there, which was exactly how I liked it. Then, about 8 months before all this happened, the Callaways moved in next door. Ethan and Vanessa Callaway, Los Angeles money, tech money, apparently. The kind of people who wear hiking boots that have never touched mud and say things like, "We're reconnecting with nature," while posting drone footage on Instagram. They bought the empty ridge lot beside mine for almost triple asking price, and within a week, there were architects, surveyors, landscape designers, contractors. Hell, I think they even hired somebody whose entire job was choosing outdoor fire pit aesthetics. The first time I met Ethan, he was standing on my property flying a drone over my roof with the tablet in his hand. Didn't even ask permission. I walked out onto the porch and said, "You mind keeping that thing off my land?" He looked at me, smiled real casually, like we were buddies already, and said, "Oh, relax, man. I'm just mapping sunlight angles." Sunlight angles. I remember laughing because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Over the next couple months, the ridge turned into a non-stop construction site. Cement trucks at sunrise, nail guns all day long, workers blasting music off Bluetooth speakers while I was trying to split firewood. And Ethan? Man, Ethan had this way of talking to people that made every sentence sound like a TED Talk nobody asked for. One afternoon, he walked over holding rolled-up blueprints and said, "We're trying to create something transformative for the valley." I said, "Buddy, it's a mountain, not a yoga retreat." He laughed way too hard at that. The weird part is, I actually tried to be decent about everything. I'm not one of those guys who hates anybody with money just because they've got more of it. Hell, if somebody wants to build a mansion in the woods, good for them. But there's this unspoken rule out there in places like Alder Ridge. You respect boundaries. Property lines matter. Privacy matters. You wave when somebody drives past. You mind your own business. And you sure as hell don't act like the mountain belongs to you because your checking account says so. Ethan never understood that. And looking back now, I think the moment he first saw my cabin sitting on that flat piece of ridgeland, he already decided it was in the way. Then I got home from Bozeman and found out just how far he was willing to go to move it. I got out of the truck and walked straight toward the crew, trying real hard to stay calm because once you grow up around construction guys, you learn pretty quick that yelling usually gets you nowhere. But the closer I got to that steel rig beside my porch, the harder it became to think straight. These people had drilled anchors into the ground less than 10 feet from my foundation. My foundation. There were hydraulic jacks stacked near the stairs, cables running through the dirt, fluorescent markings sprayed around the support posts I'd installed with my own hands a decade earlier. Somebody had touched my home while I was gone, and I swear to God it felt more personal than a break-in. A foreman wearing a white hard hat looked up from a clipboard and gave me one of those fake customer service smiles. "You, Caleb Mercer?" I said. "Depends who's asking." He chuckled like we were pals. "We're preparing the lift zone." I looked at him for a second. "The what?" "The lift zone. For the cabin rotation." I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "The cabin what?" He flipped a page on his clipboard completely serious and said, "We're rotating the structure approximately 11 degrees east to improve the neighboring property's sightline corridor." That sentence still pisses me off when I think about it, not because it was rude, because he said it like it was normal, like moving another man's house was some routine landscaping project. I said, "You're telling me somebody hired you to move my cabin?" He nodded. "Temporary adjustment only. Shouldn't take more than 2 hours once the rigging is complete." 2 hours. 10 years of my life reduced to a 2-hour inconvenience. That's when I called Ethan. He answered on the second ring, sounding weirdly cheerful, like he'd been expecting me. "Hey, Caleb," I said. "Tell me your workers are not preparing to move my house." Long pause. Then he sighed like I was the difficult one. "Okay, so maybe nobody explained the full vision to you yet." The full vision. I remember pacing in circles in the dirt, trying not to explode while he started talking in that smooth startup founder voice of his. "Our architect discovered your cabin angle interrupts the sunrise exposure from our upper deck. We're just realigning things slightly so both properties harmonize with the ridge." I said, "You're out of your damn mind." And he actually laughed. Not nervous laughter either. Real laughter. Like I was being dramatic over nothing. "Caleb, come on, man. This helps everybody. Property values go up. Visual continuity improves. The whole ridge benefits." Then he said the sentence that pushed me from angry into genuinely speechless. "We already hired the relocation company." Like that settled it. Like spending money somehow gave him authority over my land. I asked him, very slowly, "Did you seriously think you could move my home without asking me?" And Ethan said, "Well, we assumed you'd be reasonable." That word. Reasonable. People like Ethan use that word whenever they expect everyone around them to surrender quietly. I hung up before I said something that would have gotten me arrested. Then I started taking pictures. Everything. The machinery. The drilled anchors. The markings around the cabin. Every truck logo. Every license plate I could see. One of the workers asked if I was documenting progress, and I remember looking at him thinking, "Buddy, you have no idea what kind of day this is about to become." About an hour later, I was sitting in a law office in downtown Alder Ridge, across from Denise Holloway, who'd handled a land easement dispute for me years earlier. Denise was in her 60s. Silver hair, sharp eyes, talked like somebody who'd spent 40 years watching idiots ruin their own lives in courtrooms. I slid the photos across her desk, and she stared at them silently for maybe 20 seconds. Then she took off her glasses and said, "Please tell me this is fake." I said, "I really wish it was." She kept flipping through the pictures slowly, and the further she got, the quieter she became. Finally, she leaned back and muttered, "Jesus Christ." Now here's the thing about Denise. She wasn't dramatic, ever, which is exactly why hearing her sound rattled scared me more than the construction site did. She pulled my property survey, county filings, structural permits, everything. We spent almost 3 hours going over maps while she highlighted boundary lines with a red pen. Then she looked at me and said, "Caleb, this isn't just trespassing. They've interfered with a residential structure without consent. Depending on intent, this borders on attempted unlawful seizure of property." I said, "Can they actually do this?" She gave me a look that basically translated to absolutely not. That night, she filed an emergency injunction request so fast I don't think her office lights turned off until midnight. And Ethan, man, Ethan still didn't get it. The next morning, Denise received a response from some massive law firm in Seattle representing the Calloways. 12-page letter. Expensive paper. Fancy legal language trying to argue that the proposed structural adjustment would increase surrounding property values and contribute positively to community aesthetics. Community aesthetics. These people really thought the mountain was a homeowners association. But the part that almost made Denise spit out her coffee was one sentence near the end. The Calloways proposed splitting relocation costs evenly between both property owners. I laughed so hard I actually got dizzy. Imagine somebody breaking into your garage to repaint your truck and then asking you to help cover labor expenses. That afternoon, we went before Judge Raymond Pike, who looked exactly like every Montana judge should look. Late 60s, worn face, voice like gravel dragged across pavement. Denise handed him the photos without saying much, and he started flipping through them one by one. No expression, nothing. Then he stopped on the image showing the hydraulic lift frame beside my porch. He lowered the photo slightly and said, "They planned to do this while the homeowner was absent?" Denise nodded. Judge Pike stared at the defense attorney for a long moment that felt cold enough to freeze water. Then he said 5 beautiful words. What the hell were you thinking? The courtroom went dead silent. The defense attorney tried launching into some polished explanation about architectural integration and cooperative land enhancement, but the judge cut him off halfway through. No, he said flatly. Absolutely not. He signed the restraining order right there. 14 days. That's what the Callaways had. 14 days to remove every machine, every anchor, every piece of steel from my property and restore the land to its original condition. And if they failed to comply, the order specifically authorized me to remove the structures myself and charge every expense directly back to them. When we walked out of that courtroom, Denise actually smiled for the first time all week. She said, "Most people back down after a judge embarrasses them in public." I looked out toward the mountains and said, "You really think Ethan Callaway's most people?" Because deep down, I already knew he wasn't done yet. The 14 days came and went without a single thing changing on my property. Not one bolt removed. Not one truck gone. Every morning I'd walk out onto my porch with coffee in my hand and stare at that steel rig sitting beside my cabin like some giant middle finger hammered into the dirt. And the strange part was, after the court hearing, the construction crew stopped showing up almost entirely. It was like Ethan had abandoned the project out of pure spite, figuring if he ignored the order long enough, maybe reality would bend around him the same way people probably had his entire life. By day 10, folks around Alder Ridge had started hearing about the whole thing. Small towns are like that. You can sneeze in a grocery store parking lot, and somebody's cousin hears about it before dinner. Guys at the hardware store kept stopping me asking, "So, somebody really tried to move your house?" And every single time I answered it out loud, it still sounded insane. Even my neighbor Walt, who'd lived on the mountain since the 70s and trusted absolutely nobody under the age of 50, drove over one evening with a six-pack just to sit on my porch and stare at the lifting rig. After about 20 minutes, he finally shook his head and said, "I fought in Vietnam and I still ain't never seen rich people this stupid." That might have been the hardest I laughed through the entire ordeal. Then came day 15. Sunrise had barely hit the ridge when 3 diesel engines started rumbling up my driveway. Denise stepped out of the lead truck carrying a thermos and a stack of paperwork tucked under one arm. Behind her came 2 excavators, a flatbed trailer, 4 welders, and a demolition crew that looked entirely too excited to be there. Now, before anybody thinks this turned into some outlaw revenge fantasy, let me make something clear. Every single thing we did that morning was authorized by the court order. Sheriff's Department had already been notified. County records updated. Denise had copies of the injunction in a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel a little satisfying watching those excavators crawl toward that steel frame. One of the welders climbed out of his truck, looked at the structure beside my porch, and whistled low. "Hell of a thing," he muttered. I said, "You should have seen the sales pitch." By 7:30 the cutting torches were lit, and man, there's something deeply therapeutic about the sound of illegal steelwork being dismantled. Sparks flew across the dirt while hydraulic shears ripped through support beams piece by piece. Chains tightened. Metal groaned. One of the excavators hooked into the main frame and pulled the entire left side down so hard the ground shook beneath my boots. I stood there drinking coffee the whole time watching this ridiculous monument to entitlement collapse into scrap metal. At one point, Denise leaned beside me and quietly said, "You know, in 32 years practicing law, I've never had a judge authorize a client to physically dismantle another party's project." I said, "Feels historic." She smirked. "Feels expensive." By noon, the machinery blocking my driveway was gone. The concrete anchors got ripped out of the hillside. Workers loaded twisted steel beams onto the flatbed like junkyard debris. Every painted marker around my cabin disappeared under fresh dirt. It was almost surreal how quickly the whole thing vanished once people stopped pretending it belonged there. And right when the final section of steel got hauled onto the trailer, Ethan arrived, black Range Rover, flying up the hill too fast, gravel spraying everywhere. He jumped out before the SUV fully stopped, wearing sunglasses and one of those expensive wool coats people from California think makes them look rugged outdoors. For a second, he just stood there staring at the wreckage. Then his face changed colors. I've never seen a grown man go from pale to red that fast in my life. "What the hell is this?" he yelled. Nobody answered. The crew kept working. One of the welders actually started humming to himself. Ethan stormed toward me, pointing at the trailer full of twisted steel. "You destroyed private property." I handed him a copy of the court order. He didn't even look at it. This cost me over $100,000. And I remember this weird calm settling over me right then because for weeks this whole situation it felt unreal, like I was trapped inside somebody else's bad reality show. But standing there watching him finally understand he couldn't bully his way through everything, I realized the mountain had finally told him no. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, Ethan, you tried to move my home." Silence. Just wind moving through the trees behind us. His wife Vanessa climbed slowly out of the SUV around then, took one look at the destroyed rig, and honestly, she looked less angry than embarrassed. Like somewhere deep down she finally understood how insane this whole thing had been from the start. Ethan threatened lawsuits for another 10 minutes while Denise stood there checking her watch like she had dinner reservations to get to. And sure enough, about 3 weeks later, he filed $120,000 in damages, construction delays, emotional distress, loss of projected property value. I swear half the complaint read like a man suing reality for not cooperating with him. The case lasted maybe 12 minutes. Judge Pike barely let Ethan's attorney finish the opening statement before shutting the whole thing down. Then came the part I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The judge looked directly at Ethan and said, "Mr. Calloway, you attempted to alter another citizen's residence without permission because it interfered with your scenic preference. You are fortunate we are discussing civil penalties and not criminal charges. Case dismissed." That was 8 months ago. The Calloways still own the lot next door, but construction stopped completely after that. Half-finished foundation sitting up there collecting snow and pine needles like a monument to arrogance. Sometimes I see Ethan outside when I'm splitting wood, and every now and then we make eye contact across the ridge. Neither of us waves. And honestly, part of me still wonders what would have happened if I'd stayed gone another week. Because here's the truth nobody likes talking about. People with enough money eventually start believing boundaries are optional, that laws become suggestions, that regular people always move aside if pressured hard enough. This time, one of us didn't. So now I'm curious, if your neighbor tried to move your house for a better view, would you have handled it differently? Or do you think Ethan got exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments, because I promise you, folks around Alder Ridge still argue about this one.